Today I wanted to talk a little bit about my first impressions and initial experiences of transitioning from the Panasonic Micro Four Thirds cameras to the Sony full frame cameras like the A7S III that I'm filming on right now. And as you might expect, there's a bit of a learning curve when you just jump to a new system, and there's also some comfort that has to be given up or sort of adjusted as far as the physical camera bodies and where things are in the menu and the button layout and all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to talk about some of those things, but before I do, I also wanted to tell you just a little bit about why I even am switching into this anyway. Now, the Panasonic GH5 has been a fantastic camera. It's still extremely relevant, and I would recommend it to anyone who needs what it can do. It's still a currently great camera, and you can get them for dirt cheap now. I think it's like $1,200–1,300 for a new one, and that's just a great deal for what this camera can do. And the Micro Four Thirds lenses are pretty affordable, especially considering the performance that you can get out of them. They're kind of small, so you can get around with them. There's just so much to be said for it. But having said that, I personally always wanted to get into a full frame camera system at some point, and last summer, as you might know, Canon released the R5 and R6 and Sony the A7S III, and these cameras really brought the full frame capabilities in terms of video in these mirrorless cameras. It brought them into a place where they're actually able to do pretty much everything you could get from the Micro Four Thirds system, and in some ways they've actually surpassed it, especially with some of the high frame rates that you can get out of these cameras. So with that in mind, I decided it was time to consider switching to a full frame system, and I considered both Sony and Canon. I also considered Panasonic because they had the S5 and the S1H. But the problem with Panasonic for me, there's actually a couple of problems. One is the autofocus system. I was really wanting to get something with reliable and smooth autofocus like the Sony and the Canons can offer. And Panasonic has stuck with that autofocus system even in their full frame cameras, as you well know. And the S5 and S1H, while everything else is fantastic in those cameras, to me that just really kind of keeps them from being right at the front of the market. Otherwise, the S5 might be the absolute perfect hybrid camera. The other thing though is that Panasonic has the L-mount system, and there just really hasn't been quite as many lenses to fill in all the gaps, and not a lot of good affordable options in there that really kind of fill up that whole line as far as I'm concerned. And one last thing is there's not really an obvious link between those mirrorless cameras and what Panasonic makes in terms of cinema cameras, whereas both Sony and Canon have started to kind of bridge that gap in a way where you could buy lenses that would, for your mirrorless cameras, that would then transition into use for a cinema camera if you bought one of those. And with Sony, I felt like they really checked all the boxes, and they had the smoothest transition, I think, between their mirrorless cameras and their cinema line with the new FX6, because that's basically like an A7S III in a cinema body. So I aspire to possibly buy that camera at some point when the funds allow it, and hopefully I'll be able to build up a good lens collection that would work both for these mirrorless cameras and for the cinema cameras, and not have to just start all over again with lenses. So those are the reasons I've gone with the Sony. It's not just the A7S III and the A7 III that I've bought, but it's also the fact that there is an FX6 that I might want to move to in the future, and I can bridge that gap with the lenses that I buy. So that's important to me, is to think about the future of the system and where it's headed. So, with all that having been said, now let's talk about some of the transitioning that has taken place. Now, again, I love the GH5, and some of the first things that I want to talk about are really its strengths. And right out of the gate, it's the body of this camera. That was really what sold me on it. I was considering this camera, but then when I went to a showroom and picked one up, it was actually a Best Buy that had a good camera collection there on display, and I picked up their sample GH5, and I was like, man, that camera feels perfect to me. The grip and the size, the weight of it is just perfect, and with larger lenses it's balanced just so well. The grip just is it's chunky, and you can hold on to it for a long time without a lot of fatigue or anything, and the weight of the body, it kind of gives you confidence in it's weather sealing, and the grip feels really good. It's easy to hold on to it. That texture of rubberiness is really, really solid for the grip. Now, some other things about the body of the GH5 I really like is that the button layout is really sensible. There are a lot of button options, but they're all laid out in a way that's kind of easy to understand. It's not too cluttery. I do have one complaint though on the GH5, and I think most people feel the same way. It's that that little display button there is just in a horrible place. It's so easy to press it by accident, and it happened to me so many times, especially when I'm doing stills, because you grip it right there and pressure just pushes that display and just changes what you have on the screen randomly. So that bothers me a little bit about it, but other than that, that's the only fly in the ointment, I guess. Otherwise, this is just about a perfect body as far as I'm concerned. I love the size, the weight, and the shape of it, and the button layout. Now, let's look at the Sony. By comparison, is a little bit smaller. As you can see, the grip, now I've got kind of short fingers for a dude, and the grip to me even feels kind of small, and the camera is a little smaller anyway, so if you compare these two, you can see that the Sony is slightly smaller, not quite as chunky, and it's a full frame, which is, it makes it a little ironic that it seems a little smaller and not quite as robust. But it's still good. And the thing I've noticed though is when you put a larger lens on it, this is just their little nifty 50, so it's not real big, but when you put a larger lens on it, it feels more like you're holding on to the lens and stabilizing just a little bit by holding the camera. So, so it's a different feel to me, whereas I feel like when I hold the GH5, no matter what lens I put on it, it's really the camera where I'm gripping for leverage. But anyway, that's a little different, a little bit of an adjustment, not good or bad, just different. I feel like the grip on the Panasonic, the texture is a little bit easier to hold on to. This is a little not quite as rubbery, so it feels maybe a little less like a stable grip. But that's a small thing. Now, as far as the button layout, it feels a little cluttery, I think, because the body is slightly smaller on the A7 III and the A7S III. So maybe a little less real estate, but they've really jammed it with buttons. And really, again, that's something I'm just getting used to more than anything else. Not too crazy about the doors on the A7 III. They're dangly and flimsy. That's not real confidence inspiring, and I hope to not break any of these things. They improved that on the A7S III, whereas they're a little rubberier and they actually feel a little sturdier and they don't flop around like that. Now, one thing I do like about the button layout on the Sony cameras is they've included an exposure compensation dial, which has already come in handy when I was shooting photos the other day in a dimly lit room at our church. I was filming some of the music, or actually taking photos, stills of some of the music performance, and that actually helped me deal with the harsh lighting situation and not clip my highlights in the photos too much. So that actually is really handy, and I have not had a camera that had that on the exterior of the body before, so kudos for that. Now, another thing that's kind of weird about the A7 III as opposed to the A7S III is that the card slots are actually backwards. As you can see here, the slot number 1 is on the bottom and slot number 2 is on the top. Now that's backwards not only compared to the Panasonic camera, but also the A7S III and any other camera I've seen, so kind of odd there to me. Another thing I find interesting is the cards go in backwards. Most cameras, the cards go in this way, but these cameras, the cards go in this way. So to me, that's a little odd and just something to get used to. And again, not something that's bad. It just seems a little counterintuitive and backwards to me, but I'll get used to that. The A7S III has a full-size HDMI port, so that's really cool. And I'm using it right now because I'm using an external monitor. But the A7 III only has the micro port, but I'm glad it has a port, you know, so you can use it if you need to. It's just not as sturdy. Now, another thing I'm having to get used to about the Sony cameras is they put their lens lock in this little crevice right here on this side, which is exactly, or pretty much the same place as the Panasonic FN6 custom button, which I actually use a lot for Wi-Fi when I'm filming myself, and then also I use that button as the extended teleconverter whenever I'm out shooting video of wild animals and stuff. So that's something to get used to as well. And there is no custom function button on the front of the Sony cameras. Now, as far as the firmware and the user interface is concerned, it's definitely something to get used to. The A7 III has very limited touchscreen functions. It's really mostly that you have to navigate things with the dial on the side here. So you can't really go into the menu and touch things. It doesn't do anything. So you have to use the dial, which is a little bit harkening back to my old Canon T3i. But it does work, and it's fine. You just have to kind of go back in time a little bit. Now, the A7S III has a dramatically improved touchscreen. It's fully functioning, just like the GH5 had. And then also the A7S III has a lot better menu layout than the A7 III. And it's a good thing too, because there's an awful lot of stuff in there, so it definitely needs to be laid out in the way you can get to it. Now, I'll solve some of these problems of dealing with the different menus by just trying to put what I think I'll need in the My Menu sort of customization in there. So that definitely is a workaround, and it's fine. You just kind of have to study it a little bit. So the things about the menus are really just something to get used to. I think a lot of people have complained about the menu system on the Sony cameras, especially the A7 III. But really it's kind of, learn it and stop worrying about it, I guess. And just put what you think you'll need the most in the My Menu section, and then that way you'll know where that is. Otherwise, it's just a matter of learning it. Now, as for the shooting experience with these cameras, the first thing I have to say is the A7S III. The autofocus is so good, it's kind of scary. And it's actually inspiring. It's good enough that it starts making you think creatively, what can I do that I couldn't do before now that I have autofocus that can not only be trusted, but can just really track so well. So anyway, that's what I have to say right out of the gate about the A7S III. Now, the A7 III has pretty decent autofocus. I would trust it for something like this probably, but maybe not so much if the things are moving around a lot, and I probably wouldn't trust it for shooting something professional where I really had to rely on it. But what it is good at, I noticed, was I felt like it had a really good hit rate in terms of shooting still shots under those harsh lighting conditions. Like I said, I shot some photos at our church with some tough lighting environment with the stage lights and everything, and I got a really good percentage of photos that were in focus, much more so than I'm used to. The face tracking and eye detection, that sort of prioritizing faces, was really helpful in that environment. So I'm really happy with that in the stills category. Now, the A7S III for video, again, it's just got so many cool features and so much capability. I've been really impressed with it so far. I haven't gotten to use it a ton yet, but I've been really happy with it so far. I've done a lot of testing, and S-Log3 works great on it. That's what I'm using right now. It's been really easy to grade that compared to trying to do log on the Panasonic camera. I was never happy with V-Log. I used it only a few times, or well, I actually practiced with it a lot, but I was almost never happy with the results, and only a couple of times did I actually use it in a video that I used for anyone else to see. So most of the time I'd stayed away from it, whereas with the A7S III, it really seems to handle the S-Log3 profile really well, and it's mostly just dropping their LUT on top of it, and it looks great. Very little tweaking to be done. Now, as far as the A7 III, it's a little bit more like the Panasonic in that it doesn't really handle, to me, doesn't really handle the log thing so well. You can do it, and you can use S-Log2, I think, okay with it. But again, the image tends to fall apart pretty easily, and it gets noisy, and it becomes hard to know when you're not going to get some problems with like gradients between colors or luminance in the image, where it kind of turns into just banding. So I'm not really so excited about using that in the A7 III. So when I use this camera for video, I'll probably just use one of the regular profiles. They look pretty good straight out of camera, and the camera has great dynamic range anyway. So anyway, this makes a great backup to the A7S III for video, and the A7S III, I think, will probably make a good good backup to this for stills. They're just not super high resolution because of the 12 megapixel sensor that's in that camera. But I expect it to be pretty good. I've seen some good results online, but I actually have not even, to my knowledge, I don't think I've shot one still shot on the A7S III yet. It's just all been video. Now this, I have kind of tested both video and photo on it so far, just to see what would happen. But this is an A+ for stills, and the A7S III is an A+ for video, definitely. So anyway, those are just some of my first impressions about these cameras. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more for me to discover and try to adjust to and adapt to. But I'm extremely happy with the image. I think the image coming out of the A7S III for video is kind of mind-boggling in terms of how good it is. I think it's the best image I've had personally out of anything, and I'm glad because it's kind of expensive, really. But anyway, those are my thoughts about it right now and where I've landed at the moment. And I'm going to keep working through these cameras and putting them through their paces and doing more and more things with them, more jobs and more experimenting here. And I will let you know how things go with me if you want to tune back in. Like I said, I'd appreciate the company if you want to come along for the ride. And if you enjoy this video, click like, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.